Okay. Okay, so for the last part of this lecture, we're going to take a much more in-depth look at empire. We've already talked about how central the expansion of the Victorian Empire is to understanding that period, and we've looked at it a little bit, but empire really became the central focus of Victorianism in the last part of the 19th century, from 1870 onward. And so we're going to look at it in much more detail, not only in this lesson, but in the next one as well. And Rudyard Kipling, the author we're studying for this part of the lecture, he was really the writer associated with empire and with portraying India. And India was considered the most important British colony for a variety of reasons. So we'll talk about that. But India was considered the most important British colony, and Rudyard Kipling came to be seen as the purveyor of knowledge about India. And so we're going to study him in his novella, The Man Who Would Be King, for this lecture on empire. And again, we'll talk about empire even more in the next lecture. So Kipling was born in India. His parents were Britons living in India, which was very common. As the empire expanded, Britons were living all over the world, a lot of them in India. And so he was born there and lived the first 6 years of his life there, but he was sent to Great Britain at age 6 for education. His views later in life were deeply affected by the English schoolboy code of honor. He learned while at school in Great Britain, and I think you can see this in his works. For instance, the contract that the two main characters come up with in The Man Who Would Be King. And he has a lot of stories and poems about loyalty and about soldiers serving together and whatnot. At 17, he rejoined his parents in India. His father taught sculpture at the art school of Bombay, and so he did spend a significant amount of time of his adult life in India, seeing what it was like, the British ruling there. In 1892, he married an American woman, so he really had experiences all over the world, and actually lived in Vermont for 4 years before a falling out with her brother caused them to leave there and go to England. He was also what many people think, the first English author to own an automobile. Sorry for the typo. He had a fascination with engineering and technology. So as cars were invented, and the car is very much a signifier of modernity, he was the first author to own one. And he was very into engineering and technology, which again we see in the story when the two main characters acquire all those guns to carry out their imperial mission. He was also the first English author to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1907. So that's a pretty impressive achievement. And as I said, India was the most important British colony. This is a long story as to why, but there's an important shift where until 1857, India was managed by a company called the East India Company, which was for Britain, but rather than by Britain itself. But with the Indian Mutiny or Indian Rebellion of 1857, Britain decided to step in and govern India itself rather than using a company to do it. And that was this incredibly important shift because 13 years after that, starting in 1870, Britain ramped up its imperial efforts. And so that was really the catalyst for that, was really that choice to govern India itself following the Indian Mutiny. And also at that time, Victoria became the Empress of India was her title. And so these are just some of the reasons that India was considered the crown jewel of the British Empire. And Kipling lived there. He wrote many stories about India, and I have a quote later on that explains this, but people really who didn't go to India, didn't live there, really learned about the crown jewel of the British Empire through Kipling's writing. So he's very much, the writer about India for the British Empire. And we'll study all the implications of that in this lecture. You're probably famous with some of his other works, like for instance, he wrote the Jungle Book. And so you're probably familiar with him for those reasons. I think his most interesting complex novel is a novel called Kim. He wrote in 1901 because it really shows more of the nuances of Indian society. but it's too long to read for a class like this, which is why we're looking at The Man Who Would Be King, which is not a novel, it's a novella, so it's not too long, but it's still lengthy enough. It really is fairly complex and really does show us some interesting things. Before we move on and look at The Man Who Would Be King, I'd like to take a little more time and look at the topic of empire during the Victorian period. And so we're going to look at the information from the textbook in one of those Victorian issues sections, this one called Empire and National Identity. So by the end of the 19th century, nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface belonged to the British Empire. So you heard that phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire. This is why that phrase exists, and it's basically true. The British Empire is the largest empire to ever exist in terms of the sheer landmass it covered, even bigger than the Roman Empire. And it grew over time, but it reached this size at the end of the 19th century. It was a truly heterogeneous entity with which was controlled by heterogeneous practices. Sorry for the typos there. Which means it was very diverse. You can't have an empire that big and have it all be the same, despite what you could perhaps call the British efforts to try to make it all the same, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And really the idea here and why we're studying it now is the idea of the new empire, which is an ideological construct that is central to understanding British imperial expansion at the end of the 19th century. So Britain went from basically expanding at the kind of average pace they had been expanding up until 1870 to this just rapid expansion that lasted from then until World War One. The resources they devoted to World War One slowed down the progress, and the resources they devoted to World War Two would actually mark the end of the British Empire. It became too big to sustain, especially with the resources they devoted to the first two world wars. And so many of the colonies earned their independence post World War II. India in 1847, for example. But from 1870 to 1914, you had just this rapid expansion. And probably even more important than the expansion itself is the ideology behind it. And those ideologies are associated with the idea of the new empire. That's the term to label them. So we're now going to talk about what the new empire is. To put it most succinctly, it's a sense of national pride in the expanding empire. Before 1870, empire was seen as a negative thing. The British citizens, the British people, didn't really know they were this huge expanding empire. There was this economic component to it to acquire sugar and spice and all these other resources that weren't available in England but available in other countries. And so there was always this economic component to it. And before 1870, people basically saw it as this essential thing, but they didn't think of it as empire because Britain had been colonized by Rome centuries earlier. And so because of the Roman Empire in British history, the British had this very kind of negative view of empire. So they didn't think of themselves as an empire because they didn't want to think of themselves badly. And so that changed after the Indian Mutiny and the more direct intervention in colonial government. And there was just a shift that happened culturally where the British realized they had an empire and they embraced the idea. They thought it was a good thing all of a sudden. The view of empire changed in British society. There are a number of factors that contributed to this change. We'll talk about some of them. But basically, they started to view empire as a good thing. They started to take pride in it. And so they just started to expand very rapidly. And that's the new empire. What were some of these factors that caused them to begin to think empire was a good thing? Well, one was theories of evolutionary advancement. So they began to have this very romantic view of the empire as this force for good. British people saw themselves as superior to the rest of the world, but they thought they could make the rest of the world better by making people throughout the rest of the world more English or more British. And so they saw them going into other countries, removing the indigenous culture and basically assimilating people or converting them to their own cultural ways as a good thing. We can look back now and see why it wasn't, but it's important to understand that that was their impetus. That was one of the main reasons why they did it. And so I'm not justifying it here, I'm just explaining the psychological processes behind it. And so that idea of national pride and imperialism and believing that spreading the empire was for the benefit of those colonized, those are the two central ideas that defined the new imperialism or the new empire and the rapid expansion from the 1870s onward. Um, so to kind of just explain this idea in more detail, many Victorians did realize and did um, want to exploit um, the people in the colonies and knew that's what they were doing and knew that that was a big part of empire. But the majority of people and the average British citizen didn't know that. And most of the people hopped on the bandwagon of this is for the good of the world, and that became the common everyday thought. Finally, we do have literary works like the ones by Kipling that directly depict things happening in the colonies. This idea that the expansion of the empire was for the good of the world permeated all throughout Victorian society, and um, even just a everyday novel that didn't have any colonial settings would introduce that idea. And the post-colonial critic. Post-colonial is a term that refers to studying life after colonization, after decolonization, after the British pulled out. The post-colonial scholar Gayatri Spivak argues that Jane Eyre is a good example of this idea that the good of the empire comes through in all kinds of literary works, not just the ones that are overtly about empire. So this idea that spreading the empire was for the good of the world, um, that's best encapsulated in this short essay by Thomas Babington Macaulay called The Minute on Indian Education. Macaulay is basically just this old racist from 150 years ago. And clearly his views are very problematic, but they really encapsulate um, the temperament of the day, at least about empire for the Victorians. So if you look at the short excerpts from his memorandum or memo during the Victorian period, it wasn't just a minute long. If you look at the language in it, he clearly shows throughout the memo that he believes the English language, literature, culture superior to Indian language, literature, and culture. He thinks it's better. And again, that would be the Victorian view. The Victorians thought they were making things better because they thought their way of life was superior. And he has a quote in here that is the quote that he wrote this in 1835, but I think this quote I'm about to show really encapsulates the whole new imperialism idea. He says, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions, in morals and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population." So basically, taking Indian people or the colonial subjects, whomever they may be, and making them British, making them, like it says, English in taste and opinions and morals and intellect. So, English in every way except biology, culturally English, converting them, assimilating them. I always think of the Borg from Star Trek. But this is what really defined the new empire. And obviously, this is a terrible, flawed idea looking back now. Um, but at the time, it wasn't a good idea then either, don't get me wrong. But at the time, people really believed it was a good idea. And so they really believed what they're doing was for the good of other people. Um, they didn't see the racism in their ideas. And so again, I'm not justifying it, but I'm trying to give you um, and certainly not trying to garner any sympathy for Macaulay, but trying to give you insight to the psychological perspective of the average everyday Victorian and what they thought about empire. But this is why we need to study it. This is why we need to pull it apart, deconstruct it, see what was really going on. Um, so Macaulay's statement encapsulates the ideological impetus behind the new imperialism. I say ideological because there was certainly this economic, exploitive um, impetus that was probably the true impetus, but this is the ideological one. This is what people believed. Their actions might reflect something else, but this is what they believed. One question we're going to pursue throughout this entire lecture is, does Kipling support or critique this idea? Does he agree with it? And finally, the last point I want to make about this is literature was often a weapon wielded by the colonizers. So education to go along with it, but the English would say we have these great classics of literature. We need to get the colonial subjects, the Indians, the people we're colonizing, reading them. Jamaica Kincaid, a more recent post-colonial writer, has a great essay on this called Seeing England for the First Time. All right, The Man Who Would Be King. There's actually a great movie version of this from 1975 with Sean Connery and Michael Caine as the two main characters, and then Christopher Plummer as the narrator, or Kipling. So if you want to see a movie of it, this is, very well done by John Huston, who only does good adaptations of literature. So what are some of the ideas here? The central tension in Kipling is, how does he represent India? This goes back to that question I just asked. Does he support or critique Macaulay's idea of making Indian people English, culturally speaking? Leonard Woolf, Virginia Woolf's husband, who also spent some time in India, has a really good quote that encapsulates this question. I could never make up my mind whether Kipling had accurately molded his characters in the image of Anglo-Indian society, or whether we were molding our characters accurately in the image of a Kipling story. So in other words, Kipling's stories about India were so popular that he really did become the purveyor of knowledge about India to the average Victorian who didn't go to India. And so what Woolf is asking here is Kipling accurate? Or is our understanding of India only informed by Kipling? Or is there more to it? The answer is probably the latter, but it's important to think through Kipling's motives, intentions. As we study his work, we can really learn more about India and the British colonization of it, even if we don't agree with every idea he puts forth. And that's why he's important to study. So, along those lines, The Man Who Would Be King provides an action-packed tale of adventure in faraway places with strange-sounding names, which is what most of Kipling's works do, like The Jungle Book and Gunga Din. But the story also invites us to think critically about the general project of empire, about the assumptions it holds, the methods it employs, and the human cost of its endeavors. So we're going to look at these three things throughout our study: the assumptions it holds, which is the new imperialism idea. And I should mention that the new imperialism idea, as encapsulated by Macaulay, that's also really encapsulated in Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which I also assigned. So you should definitely read that, because that's another kind of example of the new imperialism. It's the white man's burden to educate the rest of the world, according to that poem. So that's the assumption of empire, the methods it employs, and then the human cost of its endeavors. We'll look at these three things. Does Kipling support or critique them? That's our central question. To answer this question, I ask you a couple more. So you can pause the lecture and answer these if you want. But if we were studying this in the classroom rather than online, what I'd probably ask you at the start of the class is, what do you think of Dravat and Carnahan? Do you like them? Why or why not? Certainly open to interpretation, as all things are, but most people would probably say no. In other words, I think of this story perhaps like the TV show Seinfeld, where you're watching these characters the whole time, but you're not supposed to like them. You're not supposed to feel sympathy for them. Their actions are deplorable. On Seinfeld, it's for entertainment purposes, their actions are funny. Here, it's Kipling's critique of at least the methods and human cost of empire. Gives us two characters we don't like, we don't feel sympathy for them. They're fools, they do awful things, but they're doing empire, they're building empire. To a certain extent, they're building the new imperialism. So giving us these despicable characters enables him to critique that. The narrator is important to how he does this. The narrator gives the audience some objective distance from Javad and Carnahan. So the narrator is a journalist in India, which is exactly what Kipling did when he went back to India as an adult. He was a journalist. So we can basically think of this narrator as Kipling. And he has some distance from the characters, Javad and Carnahan. He doesn't really approve of them. And he seems to be, to a certain extent, a fairly moral person. So we're supposed to consider him like the reliable voice, the voice of authority in the story. He's not really in it much. It mainly depicts Javad and Carnahan, and the longest, most important part is essentially narrated by Carnahan, but it's all filtered through the perspective of the narrator. So he's the one we're supposed to trust as we interpret it. And that's help us understand how to interpret it. Knowing that helps us understand how to interpret it. Here's an image from the movie that shows Sean Connery as Javad as the king. He doesn't have the red bushy beard, but I think other than that, he pretty much nails the part. So let's look at some passages. Early on, you have this scene where he first meets Carnahan and then Javad, and initially helps them, but then realizes they're part of a blackmail scam and turns them in. So this establishes something very important early on. The narrator disapproves of Javad and Carnahan's blackmail scheme and has them deported. So right from the get-go, we know that he has morals that they lack and is willing to act on those morals, and that he doesn't approve of them. So this establishes him as very reliable. And while it establishes him as moral and reliable, it establishes Javad and Carnahan as not moral and reliable. So it sets up this, important distance between the narrator and the main characters, and shows us how we're supposed to trust the narrator for interpreting the work, interpret it through his lens rather than their lens. As we do this, though, we can't necessarily assume Kipling is questioning everything about empire, that he's completely opposed to empire, because Kipling was very much a part of the imperial machine. The two then were beyond the border. I would have prayed for them, but that night a real king died in Europe and demanded an obituary notice. So he's not giving them a great amount of his time. This is as they leave and head toward Afghanistan. But he's not outright condemning their imperial project in the same way he condemned their blackmail scheme. So does he approve of their plan or not? I think it's fairly ambiguous. I think we have to interpret it. And again, I'd like to know what you think. Moving on, there's a really important conversation. This is later on after Carnahan has come back and he's telling the narrator the story, and he's explaining how he communicated with Javad once, and he says he wrote a letter, and the narrator says, "How did you write a letter?" And he explains this method he used. But the important thing is, what comes through here is that Javad and Carnahan don't know how to read and write. They're illiterate. And so this further establishes them as unreliable. It's not a comment on the illiteracy of individuals. It's more of just a tool used by Kipling to further establish them as unreliable. And really, they're fools, which is an important thing to remember. We'll get to more on that in a minute. Okay, so here's a long quote. This one I'm actually going to read, because this one really shows the Macaulay idea, the new imperialism idea, the making them English in everything except biology, making them culturally English. And Javad says, "I won't make a nation, I'll make an empire. These men aren't," a word I won't say, "they're English. Look at their eyes, look at their mouths, look at the way they stand up. They sit on chairs in their own houses. They're the lost tribes, or something like it. and they've grown to be English. I'll take a census in the spring if the priests don't get frightened. There must be a fair 2 million of them in the hills. The villages are full of little children. 2 million people, 250,000 fighting men, and all English. They only want their rifles and a little drilling. 250,000 men ready to cut in on Russia's right flank when she tries for India. So they've accomplished Macaulay's goal. They've taken these people and made them, even though they're Indian originally, made them English in terms of morals, beliefs, values, manners, etc. They behave in English ways, is what Dravat's saying here. And he's proclaiming this as a good thing, in his opinion. We have to ask, though, does Kipling agree? There's this very clear distance between Kipling and these main characters. And he questions a lot of the things they do, but does he question this? That's what we're continuing to pursue. And how does it end? So what's interesting is Dravat's undoing is when he decides to take a wife. It's really interesting because the contract he and Carnahan drew up, in it they swore off women and alcohol. It's part of their imperial project. But he decides because he's a king, he needs a wife. And so he goes back on their contract. And what happens is these people have seen them as gods. And so, really Kipling's really critiquing the ego here of the Victorian imperialists. And this woman is scared to marry a god. And so she bites him, but he bleeds when she bites him. And so that reveals that he's not a god. And so that's a central idea here, neither god nor devil, but a man. That's what's revealed about them. And so his hubris ends up being their undoing. This really shows the difficulty of managing, running, maintaining an empire. The British Empire became too big to maintain. And so you have this human nature come through. Despite his contract he made with his partner, he can't restrain himself from taking a wife. And so that shows how the empire, so quickly falls apart. And I really think what Kipling's arguing here is that building this kind of empire is a fool's errand. And I'll just real quickly mention, I wanted to on the last slide and I forgot. Billy Fish is a great example of the Macaulay idea of the new imperialism, because he's this Indian guy who then gets a English name, Billy Fish. And finally, we have to ask, okay, he condemned their blackmail scheme. Carnahan comes back, tells him the story. Does he condemn what they did? And he says, I waited to hear no more, but the poor wretch into my carriage and drove him off to the nearest missionary for eventual transfer to the asylum. He repeated the hymn twice while he was with me, whom he did not in the least recognize, and I left him singing the missionary. So does the narrator condemn or condone their actions? It's not clear, but he definitely pities Carnahan. And so this is this fool who's gone on this fool's errand, and the empire has fallen, and there's a shell of a man, if that, left, and he dies the next day. So he feels pity for that man. I think we say here he's not condoning his actions, but let's explain that as we look at what we learned. And here's an image of Dravat, Sean Connery's Dravat, at the wedding, right before she bites him in the movie. It's a central idea. Kipling shows how a fool can become the absolute ruler of a people, but only a fool would want to become the absolute ruler of a people. So Dravat and Carnahan are fools. I think we showed that pretty clearly through the close reading. And they build it. So they achieve, So they achieve what Macaulay wanted. They achieve this new imperialism, but they're fools, and it crumbles. And we're not supposed to respect them. We're not supposed to want to be like them. To go back to the Seinfeld analogy. And so he's ultimately critiquing this. But what is he critiquing? And so I want to come back to what we looked at before in order to see what exactly he's critiquing. So there's three things: the assumptions of empire, the methods of empire, and the human cost of empire. The fact that the narrator is separate from Dravat and Carnahan, that he condemns their actions, I think he's most definitely condemning. The methods and the human cost of empire. But is he condemning the assumptions of it, the motives of it, the impetus behind it? This Macaulay-like conversion occurs. The Indian person becomes Billy Fish. Carnahan and Dravat do deplorable things. And what Kipling's showing here is the deplorable things Dravat and Carnahan do are part of the imperial experience. And that's not good, so he's critiquing that. But is he critiquing the impetus that drives that? Is he critiquing the Macaulay-like conversion? Or would he see that aspect of their adventure as a good thing? A quote from Joseph Conrad, I think, really helps here. Joseph Conrad composed Heart of Darkness, which we'll look at in a couple of lectures, and After the Man Who Would Be King, chronologically, it's the next most important text to studying imperialism. It's probably the most important one, but chronologically, it's the next big one after The Man Who Would Be King. And Joseph Conrad said, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking of it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it much." So Conrad is critiquing the methods and the human cost of imperialism. But then he says, what redeems it is the idea only. So he's approving of, to a certain extent, this is a challenging quote, and we'll look at Conrad in more detail in a few lessons, but Conrad at least is approving of the idea behind it, of improving the world through imperialism. So is it an ideal that can never be achieved because the methods are too brutal? Do Kipling and Conrad agree with the ideal? Do we? These are tough questions, and so I leave them unanswered. I don't think the ideal is a good thing. I think diversity is a good thing. But it's not an easy question to answer. It's a complicated question. And it's one of the most central questions to understanding the Victorian period. So I leave you with it, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it.